Hello there, and welcome to Gooner U Film Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never stops. I'm Dove, an adjunct professor here in the Film Studies department, and my friend Keith is our stalwart distinguished professor of Arsenal and Football Studies. During our regular Gooner U episodes, we cover the past week's events in Arsenal, the Premier League, and other soccer topics, but during our Film Studies episodes, we discuss a film from the annals of soccer film history and share our insights about film, history, and our knowledge of the beautiful game. This week, we watched United, a BBC film from 2011 directed by James Strong and starring David Tennant and Jack O'Connell. Hello, Keith.
Hello, Dove. How are you this evening?
I'm doing all right. This, I guess in vague spoilery terms, this movie was a bit of a downer, much more so than Next Goal Wins. We're going to keep the opening discussion spoiler free for anyone who hasn't seen the movie yet, give you a sense of whether or not you want to go out and see it and then watch or listen to the rest of the episode. So yeah, this is a movie. All I knew about it going in is it was about Manchester United.
Hence the name, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's in the name. I'm guessing you knew a little bit more about it than that, right?
Right. So it centers on an event which, if you're familiar with English football history, you will know about, and if you're not, in the 1958 Munich air disaster.
Yeah.
And its connection to what are known as the Busby Babes, a generation of young players, the first great generation of young players to come out of Manchester United, and how those events are inextricably linked to a lot of interesting changes going on in English football in the late 1950s.
Right.
And then the aftermath of the air disaster and its impact on the club, as well as some of its key people.
Right. Yeah, and I guess I wouldn't call noting the air disaster a spoiler. I didn't know about it going in, but I mean, the opening shot of the movie makes it clear something goes wrong on what is presumably an airplane. So
it is a bit incongruous. I can say this because I'm in Texas. I mean, watching that movie while wearing a pair of shorts feels a bit incongruous always. But,
yeah, right. So overall, is this something that you would recommend people go out and see who haven't before? Like, what kind of person do you think would enjoy this movie?
I think the kind of person who would enjoy this movie is someone who's somewhat interested in a dramatization, sort of a window into this era of English soccer in the late 50s, the early days of European competition at the club level. I mean, as we point out, it is a BBC movie, so it's a TV movie, and carries with it the qualities of a TV movie. Better actors than usual. Certainly, I mean, David Tennant's is a pretty big name.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the others I somewhat recognize, but sort of in that general way that they're English actors, and so are kind of in anything that's, set in England or has English actors. Or
shot in an English studio, which a lot of stuff is. Yeah, Pinewood Studios or whatever, yeah.
Exactly. So if you're interested in this sort of a dramatization of that, and I think, my philosophy with history movies is always, or historical movies is always, is it a good way to get you interested in the topic and willing to know more? And if you're willing to do that, I think you could eventually pull a lot out of it, even if, and I'll defer to you as the film person here, but even if I would certainly not characterize it as a classic of the cinema.
No, far from that. But yeah, it was interesting to me as someone who knows practically nothing about the sport in this era or the tragedy that the movie centers around. It was interesting. It was enjoyable to me. I felt like I learned a lot. It gave it a very human spin, a very human focus, and it was good. I enjoyed it. I related to the events on a human level and learned something about the history of the game. So we are about to blow the spoiler horn. For anyone who hasn't seen it, go see it and come back. We'll be here. Okay. So yeah, as mentioned, it opens on that tracking shot through the snow, covered in blood, pieces of documents, and playing cards, which we'll get to later on. And that was interesting for me, not knowing what this was about. Like, oh, that's a pretty grim way to start a soccer movie.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty grim story. Let's be honest.
Right. Yeah. So, but I didn't know at that time. So we very shortly thereafter, like, yeah, that's basically the opening credits is a slow tracking shot through snow, and then the next scene we're in a movie theater where they're playing a newsreel. It's September 1956, so the very beginning of the season, and it seemed like the whole first team of Manchester United is in this movie theater. And before the movie, they're showing a newsreel of what's going on with the Busby Babes. We learned that term. They had won the prior season, and it seems like things are going well. There's a lot of optimism about the team, and I mean, it was funny, like talking. It seemed like at the time the idea of a young team like that was novel. Is that the case?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, in any sport, I mean, we can always talk about Arsenal in our current 23-24 campaign. They are still a relatively young team, and there's a sense that you need a certain amount of experience to compete for titles. But part of the genius of the Busby Babes was their talent, sort of, and a bit of their precociousness overwhelmed their lack of experience. They were good enough that it didn't matter, and they were had the right attitude. And Busby does a lot to help instill that in them, as does, of course, Jimmy Murphy, the assistant. It's Tennant's character.
Yeah, so definitely for me, it definitely reminded me a lot of the Arsenal of today, like a very young team that's doing very well and is playing the game in a different way than what we've seen before. That was an interesting parallel to me. So the next scene we see them in practice and they're running, and I love this line that Jimmy Murphy gives. This is like our introduction to him. You win the ball, you pass the ball, you score a goal. Like, that's all there is to it. I'm definitely going to use that when I'm in my first practice with my 8 and 7 year olds this coming spring. Because at the end of the day, that's really what it is, and it's in the details that things get tricky. But yeah. So this is also our introduction to a character of Bobby. You said, yeah, as you point out, when we're preparing, Sir Bobby. What was the last name? I can't remember.
Yeah, Sir Bobby Charlton, who ends up being as the Sir perhaps indicates, ends up being one of the most famous and important figures in the history of English football.
Right. I think the reason that I was hesitant to say Charlton, that's what I was thinking, but then they play a team named Charlton, and I thought that I was like confusing the two names in my head, but no, they are the same name. So we're introduced to him, and he's practicing with the second team, and he clearly doesn't want to be there, so he's trying to bargain with Jimmy to be given a chance, and Jimmy does take him under his wing and does like work with him on what he needs to do to be brought into the fold on the main squad. They have a nice chat where he brings him out into the middle of a training ground, and they look all around in what is very clearly a CGI shot of what Manchester looked like back then. And you see he's pointing to all the different areas of industry, and like, this is why we're Manchester United. It's the docks and the packing and the shipping, whatever, like all the different types of industry in Manchester, and this is why we're Manchester United. And it was cool. I didn't realize that.
Well, sort of. So he takes them into Old Trafford, or at least the older version of Old Trafford, and that's a fun little retcon about United and how the team unites the city. There are quite a few clubs, including Manchester City, who would dispute that notion of a united city, because the name Manchester United comes from the fact that they used to actually be two different clubs in the city of Manchester that merged. We're talking in the 1860s. Like it's been a long time. But the idea is that we're uniting clubs in Manchester, and that's why they're Manchester United. But that makes sense. It does give you a hint or a reminder of the history of the city of Manchester and how industrial it is, and also to the degree to which football is an industrial sport. It is the sport of the working classes in a lot of ways. And so, this is their entertainment. The thing that draws them in, that makes all these otherwise disparate groups come together, is this club, or a club that is, at that point in time, very good.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's that's interesting. It's retconning 100 years after the fact. So yeah, but 100 in the movie's timeline, it's like 150 or so in real time.
Yes.
But yeah, so that you mentioned Old Trafford, and I guess we could call it even older Trafford, which leads me to wonder. So was it called Old Trafford back in the 1950s? And if so, when was it not Old Trafford? When was it just Trafford or Young Trafford? Whatever they called it.
Old Trafford is not only the name of the stadium, it is also the name of the neighborhood where it is.
Oh.
So that's where the name comes from. It's not a name they've given to it, because because of its age.
Right.
It's a name that's given to it because of where it's located. So
right,
similar to a lot of them, Anfield, Arsenal Stadium was Highbury. Like a lot of times they name it after the neighborhood where it is.
Right, there just happens to be an adjective in the name of where it is.
Right, and it's a very new. It's a very new thing in the English game. What you see in American sports, with the corporate name of the stadium.
Yeah.
Whereas American sports, I mean, Wrigley Field was opened shortly after the sinking of the Titanic.
Yeah. Well, it's funny in my mind. I always think of Wrigley Field as an example of like one of the few remaining baseball stadiums that doesn't have a corporate sponsor name. And then I remember, oh wait, no, Wrigley Gum. No, it is actually. Nope. Yeah, it was the first.
I mean, I think the only real example that I can think of is certainly in baseball. I mean, the Yankees still call it Yankee Stadium, and Fenway Park is not actually a.
What about Ebbett? Does that have a name?
Ebbets Field was where the Brooklyn Dodgers played, and that was torn down in like 1958.
Oh, the one
at L.A.
I'm thinking of where Baltimore plays. What park is that?
Oh, Camden Yards. Oh, it's Camden Yards.
Camden,
that's a good one. Camden Yards. Okay. That's true. That's another one.
And then is Comiskey Park still Comiskey Park?
No, it's like guaranteed rate or something. Yeah, it's had a long since had a corporate name of some kind. No, it's not Comiskey anymore. People still call it Comiskey, but
I'm sure they always will. Yeah. Okay. So anyways, then Jimmy takes him into the alley and he shows him like practicing with both feet. That if you want to be on the first squad, you gotta get good with both feet and just spend an hour a day just hitting the ball against the wall. What was kind of funny is I do kind of like 1.5 watch throughs. Like I watch it through normally, not as I would if I weren't doing a show about it. Just let the movie experience wash over me. Don't take any notes except mentally. Then I do a second one where I kind of scan through at faster speed and make relevant notes and stuff afterwards. And during that first viewing, he was telling him, keep your talent a secret, right? Like we don't want them to know how good you are, right? And I was like, he's in an alley. Who's going to notice? But what's funny about that is the callback later after the plane crash, when he's starting to get back into the game and he plays with those little kids in, I think it's that same alley. It's like a different side of that alley. And it does make it into a newspaper. It's like, oh, wow, someone actually is watching this alley with a camera.
Yeah. Of course, by that point, remember early on, they were trying to keep him a secret. Charlton is a talented young player they haven't brought up to the first team yet. Whereas after the disaster, he's one of the best players on Manchester United.
Right. Of course. By then, definitely the paparazzi or whatever they called them back then know who he is, and they're watching him. Yeah. So I thought it was interesting from hearing from Jimmy Murphy's perspective in the pub, how he likes being a coach. He doesn't want to be a manager. Like he wants to be down in the field with the guys. He wants to, not be removed a little bit. So then Busby asks him about Bobby. He mentions, how's he doing in the alternate league or something? And that's actually interesting to me because that's something that I had asked you about, I think towards the beginning of this Arsenal season. Like, is there a separate league where like the B squad competes against other B squads or something like that? And it sounds like there isn't anymore, but there may have been back then. If they're calling it an alternate league, it sounds like the alternates did compete against each other.
Well, no, there is a reserves league that they play, and there still is. The reserves play the youth players or youth levels. I mean, it's a little less standardized back then than it is today. Obviously, everything is super standardized, but there was. Basically, there were games between these youth leagues. That's how these guys got playing experience,
Right.
and developed.
Yeah, there has
so
to be,
the question was, so the manager would look and say, when they're ready, or are, when we need them, who's ready, who's more likely to fill what we need because we've seen them play a bunch.
Right. One other thing that's interesting, so I was looking up after the fact, just looking up more about this movie and the historical circumstances surrounding it. And we talk about Jimmy Murphy wanting to be a coach, not a manager. What's actually interesting is apparently Busby's son took issue with the portrayal of his father in this movie because he's always seen wearing a suit and he's kind of shown as being a business guy. They mention in dialogue that he had played the game when he's arguing with Hardaker, like saying how he's never like touched a football, like he has. Like we get the sense that he has played, but they don't show him that way. Mm-hmm. And apparently Busby was his son says the first, and he's probably at least one of the first, what they call tracksuit managers, like who they actually are in like a tracksuit. They're on the field. They're like more actively involved in what the team is doing. That was interesting. So in very short order, we get this first talk between Hardaker and Busby, and Hardaker is trying to lay down the law and say, you can't compete in Europe. We need you to participate in all of your English league fixtures, and that you can't do it. We told Chelsea not to last year, and they listened. And we get a sense of Busby's character, like he's not going to bend over, like he wants to play in Europe. Hardaker has no recourse to stop him, but this kind of sets up the circumstances leading to the crash, which again, I didn't know first time through, but basically fatal fixture congestion is what ended up being the tragedy, where like he can't miss a match. They're not going to rearrange it because he doesn't want him competing in Europe in the first place. And so they take more risks that they might not have otherwise had, like in today's world. Like if something happens, we've seen it recently, like fixtures get moved around depending on what's happening in other competitions. It's just part of the game today. But
right. And yeah, I mean, English competition, the continental competition, the European competition was brand new. It was like the third year of the European Cup.
Right.
I mean, he makes I think the Hardaker character, who's a real person, by the way, does make a comment about keeping Chelsea out of the competition, I guess, a year or two earlier. Couldn't have been that much earlier.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there is, when these things start up, and of course, Britain always has this awkward history with the rest of the continent. To what degree, that to them, even coming into the 50s, the general sense was that England was the premier team and the Premier League, lowercase Premier League, obviously. But at that point, and so like, why bother with European competition? Why? We're just better than them. What's the point? We're gonna win. We're gonna win every game in a walkover. And even if we didn't, who cares?
Yeah.
So it's definitely, I mean, it obviously with the way the movie is set up, I have no reason to think the portrayal of Hardaker is inaccurate in that. I mean, they were insistent, and Hardaker comes under criticism outside of this movie, in the course of his career for being very resistant to continental competition and the length he is unwilling to go in support of, United and other clubs going to Europe, especially at this earlier stage. Again, it's all very new here. Like, how do we know this competition is going to end up lasting or being important in the way that it ends up becoming? But,
right.
Yeah, obviously it's set the stage for tragedy.
Yeah, well, yeah, and kind of the movie tries a little bit to kind of explore the idea of who's to blame. I mean, ultimately, I don't think Hardaker or Busby is really to blame. I mean, it was a tragedy that, if anyone, maybe the pilot is to blame. But so one thing before we move on from this idea of like the new European competition, I was curious watching this. So they only call it European competition. They don't call it the Champions League or anything like that. Was this under UEFA? It was clearly the predecessor to the Champions League and UEFA, but was this actually UEFA or was it a different organization?
No, it's UEFA. So the European Cup in like the early 90s is rebranded as the Champions League.
Okay.
But this is now I'm listening up. UEFA is founded in 1954, so
right. So this is it. Yeah.
So yes, the European Cup ends up becoming the Champions League in wait for it The first Champions League. Oh, I thought 1992 is the beginning of the Champions League.
Okay.
So right around the same time as the Premier League is founded.
Now, that's interesting. Now, before they rebranded as the Champions League, did they still have multiple tiers of European competition, or did they introduce the Europa League at the same time as the separate Champions League competition?
There are a couple other competitions that existed. The Europa League comes out of, and Arsenal's won one of these. It was called the Intercities Fairs Cup.
That's a weird name.
Yeah, it involved a competition. It originally starts as almost like attempted all-star teams between among cities. Like the competition involved like the Barcelona 11, the London 11, the Leipzig 11.
Oh.
But it later morphs into using clubs from certain cities. I mean, it's an interesting one. Arsenal's won it.
Yeah. But I guess players from them.
I'll be honest, I'm not really sure. I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure how they.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is the precursor to predecessor to what was then the UEFA Cup and is now the Europa League.
Right.
And that switch came in the 70s, but
yeah. So and like I was talking about before with him being like a tracksuit manager, someone who actually did play in the game. This is a great line. Like, we're men of grass and boots and beauty. Mm-hmm. That was a good line. I like that. That was a beautiful game. So then it's right after that Bobby gets an ankle injury, and we see him with the trainer, or whatever they would have called it back then, and telling him to keep off of it for at least a week. And then he's in the next shot, like telling Busby, "Oh yeah, I'll be on the pitch tomorrow," like, because he wouldn't want to give that up. But I mean, if we're going back in time, we know how injuries are treated today. The players are babied to a large degree, like, and not in an unwarranted way. Like, the team knows if you make them play injured, you're not going to get as many years out of them. Like, it has to come from somewhere. Was that not the attitude back then? Like, were they just told to be men and just go out there and play injured? Like, if Busby had known about the injury, would he have sent him out there?
Rub some dirt on it. I mean, there was a sense you had to tough your way through injury. I mean, think about it, that American football is more famous for this, but a lot of hockey, the idea is you sort of tough your way through injuries. Especially given, obviously, as a young player, he's talked about he wants that opportunity, and now the opportunity is presented to play on the first team.
Right.
And even today, I mean, ultimately, the players have a lot of discretion.
Okay.
They're given a lot of advice and told what they think should be right. And sometimes, the manager puts his foot down and says, "No, you are not playing. You're not healthy." Because, I mean, if you ask players, they'll always say, "Yeah, I'm ready. I can play," even when they can't, But, the manager and the trainers are there to help make sure they're making the right decision. And that's the trainer's recommendation. But it was the 50s, You point out there, the response is just, put some ice on it and you'll be fine. You'll be fine. Because that's how they treated their injuries, and they were okay.
Ice it and drink some sherry, and that'll keep you from staying awake all night because of the ice. Right?
There are worse ways to spend an evening.
So he can't sleep anyways. He goes over to Old Trafford, has a forced conversation with a Bobby, not Bobby Charlton. He's Bobby Charlton, but with a Bobby, one of the police there. And it was kind of weird and awkward, and you could kind of see what they were getting at. Like, the cop doesn't believe him, and whatever. It's like you said, it's a made-for-TV movie. That's not what we're there for. Mm-hmm. But then, so the next day, he shows up at the match. He looks at the number 9 jersey, which I guess back then it was like the team's number 9 jersey, and whoever's playing in that position that day wears that jersey. Was that it?
Yeah, the rules stated that the players on the team were numbered 1 to 11.
Right.
So if you were playing, you were going to wear 1 to 11. It has been a very recent shift, like in the 1990s, where like players get numbers associated with them. Like, right. Like Declan Rice is like 34. Like, nobody would have worn 34. Like, it's ridiculous. That's a very modern change.
Yeah, so something else that I noticed is the shirts were just red. That's it. Red shirts, no crest, nothing. But the staff was wearing blazers that did have the crest on the left side where you would see it on a jersey today. And it's, more or less the same Manchester United crest that we have today. It's the predecessor to it.
Yeah.
At what point did that start changing? At what point did they start adding graphic elements to the jerseys?
In that era, you would start wearing them for special occasions. So they, by the end, again, spoiler alert, they're in the FA Cup final.
Right.
And
I saw that.
And they have a specially made crest with the phoenix on it. And partly that's because you wore a crest for a special occasion.
Right.
And in many cases, the crest wasn't a crest, a logo like we see it. In a lot of cases, it was just like the coat of arms of the town, of the city.
Yeah.
Manchester United's coat of arms, logo is based very heavily on the city of Manchester's coat of arms. Or their coat of arms or their logo, whatever it's called.
Right.
Manchester City, again, same thing. It's it's the shield, the three stripes, and a ship on the top, or the stripes on the thing. And then later, that has been somewhat replaced in Manchester United's with the Red Devil logo, but that comes a little bit later.
Yeah.
And then slowly over time, those migrate onto the shirts. And by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, just about everybody's got a crest of some kind on their shirts. And then, of course, increasingly, by the time you get to the 90s, you start to see them modernizing and starting to look a lot more like logos, more like an American sporting event. And there's all sorts of commercial reasons why you do that.
Sure. That's interesting to look back at. So then they're in the locker room and Jimmy Murphy is giving a speech and he's like, who's from such and such? And there are places, I think they're like all over England. And then he asks, who's from Charlton? Like the team that they're playing against, and nobody raises their hand. It gets them fired up to play against Charlton. That was a nice speech.
Yeah. So what you should be aware of here, and again, this goes back to the notion of the way these clubs existed and stuff. The towns he names, at least the ones I recognized, are all neighborhoods of Manchester or towns located in sort of the greater Manchester area.
Okay.
So, you could imagine if, I know, obviously, you're based outside of New York City. So you could imagine if in a locker room, someone said, who here is from the Upper West Side?
Right.
Who here is from the Bronx? Who here is from Astoria?
Long Island.
Who's from White Plains?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then he throws in Charlton. So, of course, and the point, of course, is the players are all from Manchester. They're all from this region. It goes back to that idea we talked about before, that we represent this city. And in a lot of cases, a lot of the players played for where they're from. That's where the bulk of your players came from. And then you paid money to bring in really good guys from, Scotland and Northern Ireland, not too far away, but bring them into your city to play there. And then, of course, they mentioned Charlton, which is a section of London, which is where Charlton Athletic is from. Now, obviously, for a lot of reasons, you have to make fun of the opposition there, and they talk about Charlton as sort of the tea-sipping upper class twats from the south of England.
Well, I need to bleep that.
If we have an English audience, you might have to actually. Oh, we can do a lot of that. But that sort of. This sort of effete, upper crusty, speaks in perfect the King's English kind of thing, drinks with the pinky out and all of that. One, this plays a lot into a lot of, this interesting bit, divide within England, the rugged working class industrial north and the upper crust elite educated south of England. And there's this whole structural difference there, which naturally, of course, the famous band from the north of England is the Beatles with their, hard, tough working class songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand.
They also have A Hard Day's Night.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make sense either as a Ringoism.
Yeah. But the contrast, of course, is the London-based band full of elite, highly educated kids, family-friendly, the family-friendly lyrics of the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
And I love pointing this out because the two of them, right, they come from these very particular parts of England, and they have to, in their reputation, push back against that in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, in the 60s. Now, we're getting off track here. What I find particularly hilarious about this representation of Charlton's the Docks. Like, Charlton's not upper crust anything.
It's blue collar London.
It's pretty, but as much as, if not more so, than some of the Manchester area places they're talking about.
Right.
So that was part's like kind of, again, the things you do to psych yourself up, which, as an outsider who is neither a fan of Manchester United or Charlton, you just listen to go. But okay. But yeah, again, that representation of you try to see what it is they're trying to say and the story they're trying to tell there.
Right. So then from the locker room, they're in the tunnel, I guess, like to go out onto the pitch, and you have the two teams lined up, and one of them is talking to the one guy from Charlton, saying he's such a huge fan of his. He's like watched him. He's been an inspiration to him. I think it was Bobby, but I don't remember. And then they're making fun of Duncan, who's like Bobby's buddy, who he was encouraging him to get on the first squad and stuff. He's like stretching, and he's like, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm doing exercises." And I'm like, "Oh, I thought that's what we were about to do out there," like making fun of him for like actually treating this like an athletic competition, which is kind of funny. I guess that was the attitude at the time, is like, what are you doing? We're just going to go out there and kick a ball around. What are you stretching for?
I mean, recall that Arsene Wenger ruffled a lot of feathers. This was in the late 1990s the mid to late 1990s when he started Arsenal, by telling them, guys, you probably shouldn't follow up practice by going to the pub and drinking 3 pints and a basket of fish and chips. Like maybe a salad would be good,
Yeah.
Like it's a lot of this nutrition stuff is still relatively fairly new. And especially in Europe, where there's still a recreational element to the sport. The U.S. is a little sooner, but the American sports prize athleticism a little bit more. So the expectation of things like weight training and things like is a little older.
Yeah.
But it's a very different kind of. Yeah, again, that's that little subtle thing they're watching, going, "Huh, you stretch before a game? What a dork."
Yeah. So then we get to the match, and this movie makes an interesting choice not to show soccer being played except at practices. The matches are always relayed as you would hear them over the radio, and just kind of sound bites and talking about the final score. It's an interesting choice, I guess,
because coordinating the production of a game is just too difficult.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's beyond the budget of what this is doing. And ultimately the result is what matters to the story. And we hear, they won 4-2. Bobby scored 2 out of their 4 goals. So it was a great debut for him.
Yeah, 2 goals on his debut performance. He integrates him very nicely as another one of the Busby babes.
Right. So then after this, we hear of a song, "The Team That Gets Me Excited," Manchester United. Do you know, was that a real song?
I don't know, but probably.
I guess it must have been, probably. Yeah,
yeah, probably. I mean, it was too goofy to not be made up. And there are a lot of those like weird sort of thing, like popular cultural things that sort of pop up in support of certain sports teams, and they just kind of fade into the background, but they represent sort of a weird subculture of the era. I mean, they can't all be the Super Bowl shuffle.
Well, yeah, in English football, we talked about, one of my favorite bands, Atomic Kitten. I call them a band is probably stretching the definition of a term band, but group, where they took their song "Whole Again" and called it "Home Again," and like Southgate, "You're the One, you still turn me on." They didn't change that lyric, and it's a little weird in this song, but "Football's coming home again," like where they did that.
Oh yeah. Well, it's coming home. That's from Euro '96. Right. It was held in the "Football's Coming Home." Still not coming home, but anyway.
So then we get a montage of newsreels and game results, and they've traveled to Yugoslavia, where we find out later, I guess, they won the first leg of their competition against Yugoslavia, I think.
They played Red Star Belgrade. Which was this by the way was back in the days in the old days of the European Cup. The Champions League, the European Cup, only invited league champions.
Right.
So in that case, they're playing, and again, kind of an interesting thing. They're crossing into the Iron Curtain, so they're going into Red Star, into Belgrade. At that stage, there was the quarterfinals. United won the first leg.
Oh, you know what? actually, that's later in the movie. I forgot. This is talking about them that they will be traveling. They haven't gone there yet. That's where they're coming back from.
They win
later.
the first leg at Old Trafford, and then they're going to travel to Belgrade for the second leg.
Right. Okay, that's right. So we get the phone call between Busby and Hardiker where he's trying to convince them to move their Wolves fixture, which that's funny to me. Like, Wolves, they were still around. They're being played by Manchester United. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they called them Wolves. It sounds like they called them Wolverhampton, or Wolverhampton Wanderers was the term that they used back then.
Yeah.
I call them Wolves in the notes because that's how I know them. But
that is still their name. Right. And you'll see them referred to a lot as Wolverhampton Wanderers because that is their name. But also sometimes just Wolves is just easy to say.
It's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to write. So that's what I went with. But so nope. Hardiker is being hard-nosed about it and will not move the fixture back. So they must be in England 24 hours before kickoff or else lose points. Yep. So at practice the next day, they talk about flying private for the first time. This is a big deal for them. I guess they usually just take a bus between fixtures, or I guess fly commercial in Europe is what they would have typically done. Or take a train. I'm not sure.
For traveling to the continent, I mean, I guess it depends where they're going. I mean, remember, Belgrade is a bit of a hike from Manchester. So, I'm trying to look through their who they played in earlier rounds. Well, before that, they had played. They played in Prague. Before that, so it probably did fly commercial. And then let's see, was there any other game before that? They played. Well, before that, they played Shamrock Rovers out of Ireland. So that wasn't. That was their first. That was their first round game. So
question now, tying that to modern day practice. Do you know when Arsenal plays in Europe? Do they fly private?
They probably fly a charter.
Right.
So it might be a commercial airliner, but it'll be they're the only ones on the plane.
Right. That's mainly what I was asking. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Those are arranged, and that's all taken care of. It just, if only to help streamline customs, to help make sure that, they're, let's put it this way, they're not standing at the baggage carousel with the rest of in baggage. They're not in baggage claim like the rest of us.
Right. So then we were introduced to their new keeper, Harry. He's an animal, but he's our animal. I love that. And then he's like, I'm here to win matches, not join a social club. He's all about business. So it's also revealed to us that Jimmy is on international duty. I guess Jimmy Murphy was the manager, maybe instead of coach of the Welsh national team. So that'll come up later.
He is Welsh. And in those days, the national teams played much fewer games.
Right.
So in a sense, they were very ad hoc. And so who's going to manage you? Well, we had a Welshman's the assistant at United under Busby. I mean, if he wants, they called and asked if you want to do it. Okay, he'll show up. He'll give them a formation, run them through some drills and practice, and then, try to set them up to win. And he was actually probably the best coach Wales has ever had.
Right. Yeah, sounds like it. Yeah. So then after that, they go to a nightclub, and Duncan tells Bobby not to tell any of the girls that he plays football because they make so little money back then. No girl's going to want to consider him a prospect. tell him you're a plumber instead.
Yeah. Well, they don't make a lot of money, and it's not a very long career. So, if you're looking for prospects, like, an athlete? No.
Right.
No.
Yeah. It's funny how things have changed since then.
Plus, also, you could think about it in terms of, you think about how they travel all the time, and
Oh, sure.
boys on the road.
So it is February 3rd. They board the plane to Yugoslavia. They take a photo, which the way they emphasized this photo and the coloring on it was like very sepia looking, like even more than the rest of the movie. That has to have been a real photo that Manchester United fans know, or something, of his team, basically, like at their peak before heading to Yugoslavia, and most of them tragically dying. That had to have been a recreation of a real photo, it looks like.
Oh, absolutely. I've never seen the actual photo. I tried to dig around for it as I was watching afterwards, but I didn't see any version of it. But that's clear. That's clearly a recreation of a real thing.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, they cross the Iron Curtain. They show them going through customs. The one player has his suitcase full of food. He's got a potato. It's like, they don't have food over there.
Yeah. Not food you necessarily want to eat.
Right. Yeah, so we get the result of the Yugoslavia match that is delivered over radio, and it's kind of funny because I was watching this like right after our Porto match. It was like the week following our Porto match, and so it was the same thing where like Drew in the second leg. Oh no, it wasn't the same thing, but the whole like multiple legs and stuff was fresh in my head. But yeah, so they drew in the second leg, but their score was 5-4 in the aggregate, so they won. They advanced in the competition. The captain leads them in the dining hall, like, you know, singing a song together. It's a great like team cohesion moment, and then they get on the plane to Munich. And they're playing cards. So I noted the time. It is like 33 minutes into the movie when the plane's ready the first time in Munich, and they board and the plane tries to take off. And so 33 minutes into like a roughly 90-minute runtime is all we get to meet this team before unraveling the team and killing off a lot of them. So I did overall like the way that this like lead into the crash was shown. So they show the plane like bouncing around a lot. They say it's a small technical problem. They need to return to the start of the runway and make another attempt. So they have another bumpy attempt. They say there's a few technical difficulties. They return to the terminal. Duncan very smartly sends a telegram or to his wife or fiance. I wasn't sure what she was. I don't know if it was made clear, but they get back on the plane. Busby has reservations. He looks in the movie like he's the last one to get on, like he's really thinking hard about whether it makes sense to do this. In the moment, would he have really been thinking that? I don't know. Maybe not. It's hard to say. So then they get on the plane and the guys are all shifting toward the back and try to get Bobby Charlton to come with them. They're saying, oh, it's safer toward the back. Like if something happens, they'll be safer. I have no reason to think that that's true in general. And it looks like when you see what happened, like reading about the details of this crash, it actually looks like that led to most of the first team dying because it was that back end like exploded. That back end hit into a barn or something like that and ended up actually blowing up. And that's why the casualties on the first squad were so severe, is they'd all moved to the back of the plane, it looked like. So that was not great.
Or certainly the players they highlighted, and you know, part of the reason they're building, I mean, some of those players up, of course, is because they're the ones they highlight as being killed, and so those are the ones they are, you know, like obviously them moving to the back, but right, so the back of the plane is what hits it and detaches and you know, breaks apart,
right,
and so yeah, a lot of the death came from that end of the plane, as it turns. I mean, even if you didn't know that, obviously the way it sets up with Charlton trying to go to the back but not being able to, obviously sets that up.
All right. Well, let's talk about something a little bit happier than the subject matter of this movie. It is Zencastr. Zencastr is the platform that we use for recording this show. It also allows you to post your show if you're just getting off the ground. So it has a few benefits. First of all, it is so easy because it is, of course, now super easy to record a podcast with Zencastr. Log in using your browser and start recording a high-quality podcast right away. Record studio-quality sound and up to 4K video with your guests. Feel a sense of zen knowing Zencastr's multi-layered backups ensure you always have your recordings in the highest quality, even if the connection is unstable. It is an all-in-one solution, so if you've ever thought about podcasting before and you gave up thinking you needed a lot of different tools and services, those days are over. With Zencastr's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast all in one place and distribute to Spotify, Apple, and other major destinations. If that sounds good to you, go to zencastr.com/pricing and use our code Gooner, and you'll get 30% off your first month of any Zencastr paid plan. As always, a link will be in the description to take you there. I want you to have the same easy experience as we do for all our podcasting and content needs. It's time for you to share your story. I really liked the way that they portrayed the crash. I thought it was evocative. It didn't require a huge special effects budget, which may be one of the contributing factors to why they showed it this way. But I thought it was really good. It just showed like severe camera shake, like more than you've ever seen, even in the most Star Trek-y of moments where like everyone is like moving around on stage simulating motion. Like it looked like really bad, like something bad was about to happen. It gets worse and worse, and then the screen just goes black and silent, and something bad has just happened. So by 40 minutes in, we're back at our opening shot, just kind of tracking, pointing down over the snow again, seeing the aftermath. And then we see some players coming to, and we see the real story of the keeper, Harry, like actually going back in, pulling people out, like saving lives because he wasn't hurt enough and he had the fortitude and, that was courageous enough to go in and do that. That was really cool. Bobby doesn't have it in him. He's like kind of shell shocked, and we see how he ends up, taking a long time to recover from this. Yeah.
His injuries, obviously, as they're depicted there, are definitely definitely more psychological than anything else. Physically, he seems. Right. I mean, he has a few wounds, obviously, and
his head's bandaged a bit, but
his wounds are clearly psychological, which is, of course, a lot of ways about the aftermath for many of them.
Oh, sure.
Psychological aspect, and you get a sense of even Manchester United, which we think of as being a big club, which they are. There is still, especially in this early day, that sense of the family that permeates the club and the people around them, and the people that are involved and the way they talk about everyone who is there. So you can see that. Charlton has definitely shock.
Right. So we start seeing the aftermath. We see the hospital. We see everyone just kind of trying to make heads or tails out of what happened. Jimmy receives the news at Old Trafford. He's through the moon, over the moon, whatever. He's ecstatic because he's helped Wales move forward in competition, and Manchester United has moved forward. And then he finds out, and obviously he has no choice but to immediately just get on the practical side of things. Like, okay, we need to find out what's happening. We need to be the experts. He kind of gets their PR machine in motion just to let everybody know what's happening and reach out to everybody.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we should add that the big Wales doesn't advance. Wales qualifies for the World Cup.
Right.
Which up until this past year was the only time they had ever done it. I mean, when I said earlier that he was the best manager in Welsh history, that's probably the case. He got them into the World Cup, which had never happened.
Right, I forgot the details, but yeah, exactly, yep. So he was ebullient and then brought down very, very suddenly and severely. So we find out the details of who's injured and how, and it's not looking good for almost anybody. There was one shot that was interesting. So as Bobby comes to, there's a German reading a newspaper in German off on the side of the room, and he's like playing a caricature of a German, just like completely dispassionately reading the names of all these players. And Bobby asked who didn't make it, and he's listing all these people, and then those are apparently. Oh no! So he asked who made it, and I was getting it backwards. He asked who made it, and he's listing all these names, and it sounds like, oh, good, all the people who Bobby cares about have all made it. And like, no, those are fatalities. And was he being a douche, or did he not understand exactly what Bobby was asking? I don't know. But apparently,
now we're talking about the bleep button now.
I don't know. That might be below bleep threshold. I don't know.
Let's put it this way: given when we're recording, does this qualify as Gooner U After Dark?
Yeah, right.
But no, I think that's I assume that's just mistranslation. I mean, you see, they play that a little bit. I mean, imagine that you've gone through this horrific tragedy, and now you're being taken care of in a hospital. Most of the people there do not speak English.
Right.
A couple of the doctors speak English, and of course they're the take control kind of types of, you ask a question, sit down, I will deal with you when it's your turn. Like they're not here to, I'm not here to make you comfortable.
Right.
Like it's a very kind of, that can be a very disconcerting thing. And I think that's what's supposed to be going on there, is the lack of understanding between the two men to the language. And
on top of it, apparently that is based on a real anecdote Bobby Charlton told after the fact that did actually happen to him. That was a real conversation that he had. So they ripped that from the headlines. So Jimmy arrives in Munich. Basically, there's a whole lot of aftermath, and that's really the bulk of the movie, is everyone coming to terms with it. I mean, some of the more interesting things, like there's the really impactful scene. Like you have the gymnasium with all the caskets on display there and the guards watching over it. We hear from the one guard who's been to like every home match and really feels that personal attachment to the team. The younger guard is like, he has a tear at the corner of his eye. You know, we really feel how deeply this has affected the entire town of Manchester. You know, we start to get Duncan, we find out his past. This is like the personal tie to Bobby Charlton. Like it's his best friend. He's very clearly not doing well. I have a feeling Bobby Charlton knew when he was talking to him it was going to be the last time. And it turns out that it was before he headed back. It was a little weird. They kind of alluded to it because I guess to an English audience, they would know what this meant. But he was talking about taking the ferry to Harwich or Harwich. I don't know how you say those names that end in WICH. It's always different, but it was weird. I was trying to figure out. So apparently, because Manchester and Munich are both landlocked, and I was trying to and I had that feeling when I was trying to picture a ferry ride in my head and looking at it on the map. Yeah, they are both landlocked cities, but apparently you would take a train to the coast and then take the ferry across over to England and then take another train or whatever from the port city over to Manchester. But
the point they're making is he's not
flying.
Fly.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what they're saying.
And that much I got, but I got hung up on the details. Like, wait, how do you take a ferry from the middle of Germany to the middle of England? I guess it's just a shorthand that they know about. So we see that Bobby has been very severely affected by this. Jimmy Murphy goes to go visit him. He's sweeping up the yard, and Bobby just does not at all want to go back to the game. And Jimmy entreats him, don't be another one who died out there. Like, you know, you've still got a lot in you. I want you to work it out and come back. Mm-hmm. The next scene is Jimmy, who basically, because Busby was injured, like Jimmy is effectively managing the club for a long stretch in here. He's trying to find more players to get back on track and play their fixtures that they still have remaining. What I wasn't totally clear on is one guy comes in, and I looked up after the fact. I don't know if it was from the credits or Wikipedia, but Bishop Auckland. I don't know who he is, but he came in with what they call the amateurs to come in. I don't know what that meant. What group were they talking about? What
my guess is those are probably some amateur players from around the city, potentially also some of the youth players as well, the reserve team.
Yeah.
But I admit I'm not as familiar enough to know Bishop Auckland, and I assume he's a real person and represents some aspect. Because you do see he's on the phone. Jimmy's on the phone. They're like asking about can we get some players on loan for some clubs? Right,
and it sounded like a bunch of clubs did loan them a player or two.
Right, I mean because they have to put a roster together. They just don't have play. They're delayed for some time. They have to actually get a roster together.
Right.
You know?
So they show the auditioning of the replacements, and they're all shooting against Harry, and none of them are any good. Harry's yelling at all of them, just telling them how lousy they are. And then Bobby has this moment where he sees the kids playing in the alley, and he joins them, and he's kind of like gotten his love of the game back. And he doesn't quite join them yet, but he has to be in Manchester, in Old Trafford to see the Sheffield match. Sheffield Wednesday. We just had a discussion in the episode we just recorded about the different Sheffield clubs, but this one is Sheffield Wednesday, not Sheffield FC or Sheffield United FC. This is Sheffield Wednesday that they're playing. So he's in the build up to the match. He sees himself in the paper, and his family is concerned that he has so little privacy. And this random side conversation with his uncle or whoever, that hip is the most variable joint in the history of medicine, talking about his wife. It was strange, but Bobby makes him his uncle Tommy drive him back to Manchester. He has to be there. He makes it clear either before or immediately after, he's not going to play, but he wants to be in the stadium. He feels like he should be there for their return to playing. Busby in the hospital still in Munich asks for a radio. I'm a little fuzzy on radio transmission and how he would find an English language broadcast in Munich of an English soccer match. I don't know. That seems a little dubious to me. I mean, in the days before the internet, I don't know that would have necessarily been a thing.
That did strike me as kind of That didn't make sense.
Yeah, I think in reality he would have probably seen the newspaper headlines the next day, or maybe had a phone call from someone back home, or who knows? I mean, in those days, maybe he would be on the phone with someone in the stands, like giving him a play-by-play or something. But yeah,
well, that would have been a little much given how expensive that phone call would end up being. I suspect in that case, I suspect it was a newspaper, probably a couple days later. I mean, football scores weren't necessarily the most important information to be beamed or to be shuttled around. So, I mean, we should point out they show that Sheffield game. That's actually not their first game back. If you look at their fixture list, the first game back is a home game against Nottingham Forest on the 22nd. That game against Sheffield is the end of March.
Well, right. I mean, I guess seeing those dates, I assumed that they had just shuffled around their fixtures to accommodate them coming back. But so they actually did play a match before that. That's interesting.
They played several before that.
Right.
That's actually like their fourth game after the at least within the league. They essentially have the last game they played before going to Belgrade is actually an away game against Arsenal, which they win 5-4.
Okay.
And then they come back, and their next game is the 22nd at home against Forest. It should point out, United, of course, obviously they play out the remainder of their season, which was quite a few games. They won one game in the remainder of the season. They were not good the rest of the way, which makes sense when you look at what they were.
Of course, given the circumstances. Yeah, but that also explains why a movie from the point of view of United would focus, I guess, on the one match that they did win.
Well, they don't actually win that game. The
Sheffield
game,
one?
They lose 1-0.
Wait, Sheffield, I thought in my notes, I thought that they won.
They might have said that. Might have said that.
In reality, they didn't.
Details.
Okay.
Now, I would say I would say that's in the league. Let me look and see, because I'm looking just at the league. No, that's right. 19th of February. Okay, yeah, that was actually their first game back. I'm sorry, totally got that wrong. It was an FA Cup tie. That's what I was looking at their league.
Okay,
it's like,
okay, gotcha.
It is the FA Cup, and they do win. Actually, they do beat Sheffield in that cup game.
Okay, good. I'd be very disappointed if they distorted things.
Yeah,
far.
No. As you were saying, I was like, wait, I'm missing something here. I was reading the league fixtures. Yeah,
that makes sense. Well, and that's ultimately their crowning accomplishment of a season. Winning the league is off the table, but they make it all the way to the FA Cup final, probably because they'd largely made it most of the way there already.
No, they have two more rounds. They end up drawing both of those games and then winning the replays against West Bromwich Albion, and then the semifinals against Fulham. Which were elsewhere. But then they lose the final to Bolton.
Right. So that's something that they showed, and we have the triumphant return of Busby, like limping in on his cane and giving a speech, and they're just Jimmy telling them, you all know your jobs, just out you go. You got here. That's a major accomplishment for the season. We don't care how it goes. Just do your best. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they basically end the movie on a high note. We get the closing titles telling us that Jimmy stayed at Manchester United until retirement in 1971. He remains the only manager to have taken Wales to the World Cup finals, and he died in 1989. Busby won 5 league titles, 2 FA Cups, and 1 European Cup, and retired in 71, the same as Jimmy. He died 5 years later in 1994. Bobby was knighted. He played in 758 matches. It's astonishing. Scored 249 goals. In 1968, he captained the winning European Cup team. In 2008, he led them onto the pitch to receive their 3rd European Cup, which I said by that point was surely not called that anymore. But they called it that in the movie. But
that was the champion. That was the Champions League,
right? So I guess they called it the European Cup for continuity purposes within the movie, without it sounding completely out of left field. But
I mean, if you say that to a European audience, if you say the European Cup, they know what you mean.
Yeah.
And also, they probably didn't have the rights to say Champions League. Also.
Right.
I mean, the call it the European Cup is the way to sort of make sure you're referring to the long history of it, because before 1992, it's not the Champions League; it's the European Cup. Yeah. So you say you win the European Cup. Okay, it refers to that continental competition, which we now call the Champions League, but obviously it's not entirely that.
Yeah. So just some trivia about this. So apparently, ironically, snowfall hampered the production throughout. Wherever they were shooting, there was snow throughout. They had tons of delays and difficulty. except the day that they needed to shoot the crash scene when there was no snow and they had to actually make snow for that crash scene. Apparently, 20 out of the 44 people who were on the plane died on the scene, and 3 more died later in the hospital. The initial takeoffs were aborted due to boost surging, which it's a fuel mix issue, and the compressor, like, it was stalling and surging. This is in the left engine, so it's a disruption of airflow in the turbine. But then the third takeoff, so in the time that it took for them to fix the engine and get it working, there was so much snow, but there was a thick layer of slush at the end of the runway. And that was just slowing the plane down too much for it to take off. And it caused it to plow through a fence. And that ripped off the left wing. And then shortly after, the tail section broke off and hit a barn with a fuel truck parked inside. Mm-hmm. Like, just a tragedy of circumstance. Harry Gregg, the keeper, really did pull survivors out. The team got derailed in their aspirations for 10 years, finally winning a European Cup in 1968 with a new generation of players. And then the FA chairman, Stanley Rouse.
I think Rouse.
Yeah, he had sided with Busby in defying the league, actually, making them the first English team to play in Europe. So he sided against Hardaker. He sided against the English league. And that's something interesting because we've talked before about the distinction between the FA and the league in England. And I guess this is a case of the FA having the side of the club.
Well, in this case, the Premier League is the separation of the league and the FA. So they used to be, like, the FA ran the football league. So there did used to be a much closer tie between the two. And now at this point, I mean, you're right. In this case, the president of the FA thought they should do it, although the guy who ran the league, who was, again, connected to the FA.
Right.
And so there's
So 2 different people inside the same organization. That's interesting.
Right. And so the idea is, Hardaker's like, I can't stop you from playing in the league. Obviously, you're being allowed to. But, I mean, here are the rules. Here's how our competition is structured. You have to be back by this day. 24 hours before the game, you have to be in the site of wherever it is you're supposed to be playing.
Right.
And that's the rule. And that's why United is rushing back, because they have some delays along the trip. I mean, ideally, you're right. You can see that hesitation. They really probably shouldn't have gone on the plane that third time, all things considered. But
they wanted to get back. They didn't want to drop points.
If they don't get on the plane, they don't get back. They're not getting back in time. So, yeah, I mean, again, sort of the compounding of the circumstances, why they agreed to do something that doesn't look all that like a good idea. Well, it wasn't, but you can see some of the pressures that were on them to make that choice.
Sure. And obviously you never think your plane is going to crash. You think, well, if we just get on the plane, it'll be okay. We'll do our best to make it. Oh, what's the worst that's going to happen? So we don't end up making it. We're a little late and, whatever. But so another interesting fact, apparently United's previous European round in Prague was also a tough trip back. They had to take a ferry and a train, and it was taxing to the team, and they ended up drawing their following match in the league just because of it being a rough trip. Yep. And then also another thing, just kind of in the constellation of circumstances that resulted in this crash, the return flight from Yugoslavia was also delayed by an hour. They left an hour later than they'd intended to, which probably would have avoided the entire thing. Like, they would have detected the engine problem sooner. The snow wouldn't have accumulated on the runway the same way. One of the team members lost his passport and spent an hour figuring out what to do. I don't know if he ended up finding it or if they talked to the consulate and got, I don't know what they ended up doing, but that cost them an hour too. So it's just one of those things. It's crazy.
Well, yeah. I mean, any event like that is going to have a lot of different things have to happen or, go wrong to put you in a position where this sort of thing happens. And that's kind of what happened here. A lot of things went wrong and set ourselves up that they're in a position where they really shouldn't have been trying to take off. I mean, remember, commercial air travel is still fairly new in the 50s.
Right.
There's a lot of decisions that get made or, things that we take for granted as to how air travel works or how airports are maintained just weren't the case in 1958.
Right. So one thing that I noticed, and it's actually funny when we were looking, you mentioned in the episode we just finished recording earlier about during the international break, the March international break for Arsenal, we talked about the oldest football club is Sheffield FC, and you see on their crest, you mentioned that it says like the oldest football club or whatever it says. That crest shows on the left side an old style uniform on a player holding an old style football, and then the right side you see a modern looking player with a modern football, and you see the difference in style. The old balls were like dark brown leather, and they looked like volleyballs almost look like today, with like three bands at a time of overlapping material, versus today balls are generally some kind of geometric shape repeated over and over again, so very commonly hexagons, but potentially other shapes too. Like some of the modern balls will have like really huge pentagons. They do variations on it now. But when did the style of ball become like the modern style that we think of today?
So that black and white pentagon and hexagon shape, the black and whites, is actually, it's called the Telstar. It was developed by Adidas for the 1974 World Cup, which was in West Germany. Actually, it starts appearing in the late 60s, but it's 12 black pentagonal and 20 white hexagonal panels. And that's sort of like you think of the stereotypical soccer ball, the black and white. That's the Telstar. Now you see something similar, but you see it's still a basic idea of repeating geometric shapes that interlock in various ways.
Right.
But that design comes about in the 70s. Yeah.
Cool. Is Charlton Athletics still around? Are they an ongoing club?
Yes, they're in the championship currently.
Okay.
They were in the Premier League. When I started watching, one of the first games I recall seeing was actually Arsenal Charlton. Watching on television, I mean. So,
do you know, did this incident inspire the English League, the English FA, to look at it differently and like start accommodating European fixtures more? Or like what happened in the aftermath of this?
Presumably, yes. I can't.
Really obviously, we know how it is today. It's a question of like how long after this crash did they get there, basically.
Yeah, I mean that I'm not sure I could. I could say, but it definitely does sort of change the way you think about those things, because of course there was a lot of pressure put on United to come back. And that's partly what drove the decision that they were going to rush their way back, because they needed to make it for the fixture. And, you push the fixture 24 hours, that changes everything. Or potentially changes everything. I shouldn't just say like that's the only way. But that would have been one way that would have put them in a very different situation. And so I think it's part of a larger trend. The success of United in Europe in general, I think, is part of that. The fact that team advanced as well as they did, sort of. I mean, they were in the semifinals, and it sort of shows what could have been done, and what English teams were capable of, as far as competing at the club level. So I think, and eventually you start to get more and more about the money as well, and the kind of money that's available to you. There are cycles of ebb and flow. Manchester United's title sort of kicks off an early stretch into the early 70s with and you see Nottingham Forest ends up winning back-to-back cups under Brian Clough. Derby County, Clough was at Derby County before that. They go deep in the tournament as well, not to win it, but go deep. So there are a handful of successes, and then you see the big one picks up Liverpool in the 80s up until the Hillsborough disaster, and the banning of English clubs from the late 80s into the early 90s. And then sort of with the Premier League and the money, and sort of there's a stretch probably about a decade ago where like it was just English teams, like the English teams were like 3 out of the 4 semifinalists in the Champions League, and both finalists in the Euro. Like there was a stretch where the Premier League teams were truly dominant. Barcelona, Real Madrid, and Bayern Munich have reasserted the continent. But right now, you look at City won it last year. City and Arsenal, I think, are both in the short list of potential favorites here. You've got teams going deep as well in the Europa League. Liverpool is going to be a heavy favorite for the Europa League, given how good they really are. So I think there's a lot of sort of, again, it ebbs and flows. There are stretches where the Italians were the premier sides. There have been years where there was an all German or an all Spanish final in the Champions League. So there's a lot of that stuff that kind of, but yeah, there's a lot of things that go into that idea of increasing accommodation, and partly just because they can see how valuable it is to play in those games and get that kind of international exposure and and what it does for the success of the league financially in particular, but also just in general terms.
Yeah. So we talked about how football players back then were definitely not making the money they are today. What about social status? Were they still like local celebrities, if not national celebrities? Like they show them out in social events where it's like people kind of know who they are, it seems like, but it's not like today, I don't think, right?
I mean, I imagine the Busby Babes were a part of that because it wasn't just that they were good; it was also they were young and exciting. I mean, the real person who really helps elevate the soccer player to celebrity thing is actually another one of Charlton's teammates on the '68 team. It was a guy named George Best, the fifth Beatle. He was young. He was hip. He had long hair.
Wrong. Best.
He was out. He was out in public. He was out. He was always dating stars. Always out and drinking and partying. He's the one who had. I'm going to butcher the quote a little bit, but he once said, "I once gave up. I once said life decided to get serious, and I gave up drinking and women. It was the worst 15 minutes of my life." Very extremely talented player. I was talking to some people about this past weekend for various reasons, and supposedly someone asked Pele, the Brazilian star, what's it like to be the greatest player in the world? And he said, you'll have to ask George Best. a very talented player, but also like an outgoing kind of someone who wanted to be a celebrity, wanted to be seen out there. And so, it helps in '66, England wins the World Cup, which elevates the status of all of those players like Charlton. So there's a lot that sort of, again, a lot of those things are kind of going into, and it's the '60s as well, and the rise of the counterculture and, how people start to think differently about status. And again, like everything else, a lot of different things are happening in that period to elevate that.
Cool. All right. Anything else you wanted to talk about? Any closing thoughts on the movie?
Generally, sort of what I said. I think it's an interesting depiction. I kind of agree. I wasn't sure how they would depict the crash, and I was interesting. It was interesting how they did it. From the interior view of the plane like that. I thought that was kind of a neat one, especially given, of course, obviously given the budgetary constraints of a television movie. But overall, yeah, I think it's an interesting sort of look, and to me, it fits the category of an interesting historical movie in that it opens the door for you to ask other questions and dig into other things about the greater context that you see, rather than thinking about the quality of it as a film.
Yeah. No, it's I think it was good, and like we've talked about, like it was made on a TV budget. There's a lot of stuff that they're not going to do. Clearly, their entire budget went to David Tennant and recreating historical Old Trafford. Like, I don't know if they have any money left for anything else after that. But yeah, no, I think the script is sound. I think it was a good depiction of events. I think it did serve its purpose to get me interested in what had happened before, even as someone who doesn't really care about Manchester United as a team today, just the kind of overall history of the sport, how it's looked at in England, how it was looked at in England at the time. That's all relevant and interesting to me. So yeah, overall, I'd give it a thumbs up. I'd recommend anybody who's interested in the game, especially someone who follows the English game today. It's good history for that. So, well, thanks for joining us at Gooner U Film Studies. If you're watching on YouTube, you can also listen to our show on Apple, Spotify, and some other places. If you're only listening, try watching us on YouTube. There's a link in the show notes to take you there. Wherever you watch or listen, join other smart and considerate listeners like yourself and like, subscribe, rate, review, or share the show. Thanks again to our sponsor, Zencastr, and you can find us on Twitter to get updates and ask questions. Check out our description for links to everything we talk about, our sponsor, and our Twitter pages. Again, my name is Dove, and you can find me on Twitter at Dove Frankel. With me, as always, is Keith, and you can find him in a pub watching Arsenal matches and movies.
And movies. Not in the pub, though.